Good evening. We'll get started here. I'd like to welcome Reverend Brent White from Alpharetta First United Methodist Church to lead us in an invocation.
Let us pray. Almighty God, who has instituted government for the good of humanity, we give you our thanks and praise for the city of Milton and for its citizens. We pray your blessings on each one of us. We pray your blessings on your servants, and as they do the work that you have appointed them to do. Empower them with your Spirit to be wise, effective, and compassionate leaders. Give them the wisdom and patience they need to meet the challenges that lay before them. Enable them to be effective communicators. May they go about their important work with humility, reminding them always that in serving their constituents, they are also serving you. Teach them and teach all of us to follow the example of your Son, who came to serve and not to be served, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. I would like to call the regular meeting of the Milton City Council for Monday, June 21st, 2010 to order. Will the city clerk please call the roll and make general announcements?
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. I will be happy to call roll for the June 21st, 2010 regular meeting. However, I would like to remind those in attendance to please silence all cell phones at this time. Additionally, those attending the meeting who would like to provide public comment either during the public hearings or during the call for public comment, you are required to complete a public comment card prior to speaking on an item. There is no public comment for consent agenda items or items under first presentation. Those called to speak will be taken in the order that the speaker cards were received by the city clerk's staff prior to the beginning of tonight's meeting. All speakers will identify themselves by name, address, and organization if applicable. When you hear the bell, you have 30 seconds to complete your remarks. The City Council may allow public comment on either an agenda item or general public comment from a representative of such an organized group or association, provided, however, that such an individual shall file a notarized affidavit that they have the authority to speak on behalf of said organization on a form provided by the city clerk prior to the agenda item being called. Demonstration of any sort within the chamber is prohibited, so please refrain from any applause, cheering, booing, outbursts, or dialogue with any person speaking. Please show the same respect to the person speaking that you will expect to receive yourself. Anyone in violation will be asked to leave. As I call roll, please confirm your attendance. Mayor Joe Lockwood is excused and out of town. Councilmember Karen Thurman.
Here.
Councilmember Julie Zonner Bailey.
Here.
Councilmember Bill Lusk.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Bert Hewitt.
Here.
Councilmember Joe Longoria.
Here.
Councilmember Alan Tart.
Here.
Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'd like to welcome everybody here to the meeting this evening, and know you're glad to be in from the heat. Hopefully we can keep this place cool down tonight. Will the clerk please sign the next item?
Next item is approval of meeting agenda. Agenda item number 10, 1154. Staff would like to add the following item: an executive session to discuss land acquisition and pending and potential litigation.
All right. Is there anything else that needs to be added to the agenda? Do we have
No.
a motion and a second?
I'll make a motion that we approve the agenda as amended.
Second motion.
All right. We have a motion to approve the meeting agenda as amended, made by Councilperson Thurman and seconded by Councilperson Lusk. Is there any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes. The next item is public comment. Public comment is a time for citizens to share information with the mayor and city council and to provide input and opinions on any matter that is not scheduled for its own public hearing during today's meeting. There is no discussion on items on the consent agenda or first presentation from the public or from council. Each citizen who chooses to participate in public comments must complete a comment card and submit it to the city clerk. Please remember, this is not a time to engage the mayor or members of the city council in conversation. When your name is called, please come forward and speak into the microphone, stating your name and address for the record. You'll have 5 minutes for remarks. Is there any public comment?
Yes, sir. We have one public comment. That would be George Ragsdale.
Okay.
Good evening. I will reserve specific comments for later in the zoning agenda, but as part of public comment, I just wanted to make sure that I brought to the council's attention an ongoing issue. I'm speaking not on behalf of the Planning Commission. I'm speaking on behalf of only myself.
Mr. Ragsdale, would you, I'm sorry,
Sure.
state your name and address for the
Sorry.
record?
George Ragsdale, 540 Trayburn View. I'm aware, as a member of the Planning Commission, of the fact that we are having a little bit of difficulty figuring out what the right process is for reviewing amendments to the zoning ordinances. We have a number of zoning amendments that we would like to consider going forward, and right now the process that has been used or is being used is not consistent with the rules that are established for the Planning Commission. And I would like to call that to the council's attention and ask that you address that. We will have an item on the Planning Commission agenda tomorrow night where we will be approving a recommendation to come forward to you with what we think that process should be consistent with the current rules, and would encourage you to get it on a work session as quickly as we can so that we don't have another situation where it's unclear how zoning amendments are going to be handled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that all public comment?
Yes, sir.
All right, moving on to the consent agenda. Will the city clerk please sound the items?
First item is approval of the May 17th, 2010 regular meeting minutes, agenda item number 10, 1155. Next, we have approval of a financial statement for period ending May 2010, agenda item number 10, 1156. Our third item is approval of an agreement between the City of Milton and Lowe Engineers, LLC for professional engineering services, agenda item number 10, 1157. Next is approval of an agreement between the City of Milton and Back on the Road, LLC for vehicle maintenance and repairs, agenda item number 10, 1158. Our fifth item is approval of an amendment to extend the agreement term between the City of Milton and Georgia Management Agency, Inc., doing business as Roadworks. This is agenda item number 10, 1159. Our final item is approval of an amendment to extend the agreement term between the City of Milton and Optech Monet, LLC. This is agenda item number 10, 1160.
Do we have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda?
Mayor Pro Tem, I move to approve the consent agenda items.
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion to approve the consent agenda made by Councilperson Tartt, seconded by Councilperson Longoria. Will all those in favor of the motion please say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Moving on to reports and presentations, will the city clerk please sound the next item?
Proclamation honoring Rebecca McManus, recipient of Girl Scout Gold Award. And this will be presented by Mayor Pro Tem Burt Hewitt.
All right, I'm going to read the proclamation, and then we'll ask Ms. McManus to come down and we'll present it to her. Whereas the City of Milton recognizes the importance of developing fine character and personal quality in our younger generations, and whereas the Girl Scouts of America have long been regarded as one of the preeminent organizations for fostering the best qualities in our young women, and whereas within the Girl Scouts the highest honor that one can achieve is the Gold Award, which is attainable only after a 3-year process of earning standard awards, working toward 30 leadership hours and 40 career hours, and then a final project which must have a lasting effect on the community, requiring a minimum of 65 hours work. And whereas the recipient of this honor represents a collective hope for the bright future of this nation, and whereas Rebecca McManus has distinguished herself by being presented the Gold Award on May the 3rd, 2010. Now, therefore, we, the Mayor and City Council of the City of Milton, hereby proclaim and applaud Gold Award winner Rebecca McManus as an exemplary member of the Milton community and of the state of Georgia, and do urge all citizens to join in this celebration. given under our hand and seal of the City of Milton, Georgia, on this 21st day of June 2010. I'll ask that Ms. McManus come forward, and we shall.
Oh, boy. Congratulations.
And let's see, let's kind of gather up here.
Yes.
We've got the finance lady taking our picture, so we'll see how it turns out. We don't want to block anybody. Would your family like to join for a photograph as well?
Same price.
Come on here. Yeah, get right in here.
Congratulations to you all. Good job, Dad. Way to go.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Congratulations again, and we're proud to have you here this evening. Will the city clerk please sign the next item?
Our next item is proclamation honoring former Principal Ronald Tesh in recognition for his service to Milton High School. This will be presented by Councilmember Karen Thurman.
Whereas Milton High School Principal Ron Tesh has helmed Milton High School for 12 years, capping off a brilliant 44-year career by choosing the end of the 2010 school year for his retirement. And whereas during his career, Tesh has been principal of 3 United States Blue Ribbon Schools of Excellence, including Ann Arbor Huron High School in Michigan, Edna High School in Minnesota, and Milton High School in Georgia, which was honored in 2008. And whereas during his tenure at Milton, ACT and SAT scores have steadily risen, as have the number of students taking advanced placement in college-level courses. And whereas under his leadership, Milton has been known as a sports powerhouse as well, garnering state basketball, hockey, lacrosse, track and field, baseball, and tennis championships. And whereas Tesh was named a Georgia high-performing principal by Governor Sonny Perdue and was appointed to the Georgia Principals Advisory Council, where he worked closely with Secretary of Education Kathy Cox. And whereas Tesh has since 1996 maintained membership in the prestigious Headmasters Association, one of the oldest professional educational leadership groups in the nation. Membership is limited to 100 private and public headmasters in the United States, and Tesh was recently named Vice President. And whereas Tesh is the type of community-first resident we are proud to have as a resident in our community. Now, therefore, we, the Mayor and City Council of the City of Milton, hereby dedicate Monday, June 21st, 2010, as Principal Ron Tesh Day in the City of Milton, Georgia, given under a hand and seal of the City of Milton, Georgia, on this 21st day of June 2010. Thank you. Thank you for all you've done.
Thank you.
I guess we get you two copies.
Let's move down this way.
Yep.
Everybody moves to get out of the picture. Well, actually, one of them's our file.
Okay. This is we keep it. Okay.
How do you want to do this? Yes, very much so.
Thanks. Now you know, just because you're not principal, you can still show up at all the sporting events. But I'm still listening. Yeah, you can sit you can sit in the section with all of us who no longer have kids there.
Those of us that do have kids
Kids there, yeah. Yeah. Good. Well, thank you for all you've done.
Ron, thank you.
Getting your exercise.
Good for us.
All right. Will the clerk please sign the next item?
Our next item is presentation of achievement certificates to Citizens Police Academy graduates. This is being presented by Officer Andrew Phillips and Captain Sean McCarty.
While they're getting ready, I'd just like to say that I think it's great that our officers and department takes the time out to teach our citizens about what they do, and I think it's great for the citizens that have taken their time out to learn what our officers do. I think that makes a much better community when we all can walk in each other's shoes for a little bit. So, thank you.
Absolutely. The Milton Police Department kind of made it very plain early on that we'd be providing a higher level of service to our citizens through specialized community outreach programs. And we've continued in that same theme this year and taken it a good step further by appointing a full-time community outreach position to institute some of these special programs. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Citizens Academy, basically what it is it's a very abbreviated version of the academy that our actual police officers go through, and it's a snapshot of kind of a day in the life of your professional police officers. A lot of the citizens immediately started firing emails off, expressing an interest in this program, and were very active in the program. For those of you who don't know about my background, it is not in community outreach at all, so I've had to figure this out as I've gone along. Everything for me has all been on the SWAT and narcotics side, but Captain McCarty is bringing me out of my shell slowly but surely. So here I was standing at the helm. I didn't know where we were going, but we were making good time. When we're starting a program like this, I don't want to create a stifling environment where I sit and talk, they listen. I wanted to have them in a position where they could kind of steer the ship as well. So we had a basic course outline, and through great participation of our citizens, we were able to, I think, put together a good program. So I'd like to go ahead and call up our Citizens Police Academy for a presentation of certificates. And everybody who was a participant can come on up front. If you'd all kind of line up along here. Kimberly Anaskavich. Mark Anaskavich. Kieran Burke. Ann Coggins. John Copsey, who I'm afraid couldn't be with us tonight. Linwood Corley. Patricia Corley. Tim Enlow. Damian Gordon. Tom Hazlitt. Jay Powell. Donna Pugliese. Michael Stannard, who is out of town tonight as well. Laura Trousdale. And Raymond Tubach.
Why don't, before they sit down, if not to interrupt, but why don't we all go down and get a picture with them too?
Please, thank you.
You're awfully young for this crew. What's up with that? You did this on your own volition. I didn't force you to do anything. All right, excellent. Way to go.
All right, let's, maybe we need to get some of the tall people like you, councilperson, on board. And squeeze it up here. Something.
You can stand on that, Alan. It's okay.
I know if I can be as tall as you.
There we go.
All right. Thank y'all. Once again. All right, moving on to the first presentation. Will the city clerk please sound the items?
First item is approval of an ordinance to replace Chapter 54, regulating the location, placement, and leasing of wireless telecommunication facilities. This is agenda item number 101161, previously discussed at June 14th council work session. Our next item is approval of an ordinance to amend Chapter 60, Article 2, tree preservation of the Milton City Code. This is agenda item number 101162, previously discussed at March 8th council work session.
All right. Is there a motion and a second to approve?
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem, I move to approve the first presentation of agenda items number 101161 and agenda item number 10-1162.
I'll second the motion.
All right. Well, we have a motion to approve the first presentations made by Councilperson Lusk and seconded by Councilperson Bonner Bailey. There's no discussion on these items. Will all in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Moving on to the public hearings, will the clerk sound the next item?
Next item is approval for the removal of Billy Lovelace Hauling from the list of approved solid waste haulers for the City of Milton due to noncompliance with the ordinance. Agenda item number 101140. This was deferred on May 17th, 2010. Matt Marietta.
Mayor and Council, actually, I'm going to take this one tonight just after a quick conference with Mr. Marietta. This has been on the agenda before, and I think we've had some discussions both in a meeting and then individually with some of the council members. Certainly before we make a recommendation for removal of any of our haulers, we want to make sure that we have worked with them to the extent that we possibly can. We kind of hit a roadblock in the very beginning, and we just couldn't get this particular hauler to make contact with us. Thankfully, at this point, some of those lines of communication have opened. This being officially deferred to an agenda, though, we need to sound the item tonight. But again, I'm going to ask such that you want to work with this hauler. I think we're making some steps. I don't want to pull it from the agenda, but I would ask that you defer this until August the 16th tonight. At least give us 60 days of good, strong communication to see if we can bring some of the nonconformance issues into compliance. That's what I'd ask you to do
Hold on
tonight.
just 1 second. We still probably need to go through is there any public comment?
You probably need to open the public hearing and then
Okay.
take the comment and close it.
All right. You finished, Chris?
I am.
Is there any public comment?
No, sir, there's not.
Does the council have any questions for staff? Councilperson Bonner Bailey?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Chris, just very quickly, could you maybe just speak to what it is that you and staff are working with, just so that by the time we get back here in August, hopefully those will have been managed, and that way, too, for the record, Mr. Lovelace will be clear in terms of what those expectations are.
Yeah, well, for the purposes of that, since Matt's doing those things, why don't I just let him, Matt, just kind of a summary bullet point, if you'll, just for the record, say what the non-compliance issues are, that'd be fine.
The main compliance issues that I've been dealing with since I've taken over the solid waste enforcement of the solid waste ordinance has been specifically non-payment of the mandatory infrastructure maintenance fee, which is supposed to be 5% of whatever that company's gross receipts are for service within the city of Milton. And then also the second issue that the city manager alluded to was not having a posted telephone number or means of contacting the individual. Obviously, we rectified the first situation. So the second one that we're very interested in rectifying is the infrastructure maintenance fee, and we're trying to work with them to set up a means of remediation. They also had several other performance issues that was causing them some consternation among their customer base. And in speaking with representatives of Billy Lovelace Hauling, it seems like they're making some pretty positive steps in that direction as far as coordination and timing of their routes to improve their pickup. So I feel fairly comfortable that we have at least a direction, which when this originally went on the agenda back a month or two ago, I was receiving a blank wall. I was looking at a blank wall and not getting any feedback. And so I feel like now that we're actually at the table and we're working together, some more time to see, to give them an opportunity to fix their problems might be in order.
Well, thank you for that, and obviously I appreciate that update, and I think that'll help Mr. Lovelace, obviously, between now and August, and it sounds like communication has been a key factor, and that's making some
That's
positive
largely,
strides.
yeah, Councilmember, that's largely what caused this in the beginning, with phone calls and certified letters. And when those stopped working, we really had no other option but to try to bring this hauler in compliance with our ordinance by removing them from the process. But you're right, thankfully those lines of communication are open, and give us a couple of months to work on it now that they are, and we may or may not be back in the same position on August the 16th.
And Chris, do we have a mechanism, maybe this for you or for Stacy, who I know is still here, I think. Do we have a payment plan mechanism? I mean, do we have that as a mechanism when a situation like this arises, if they can't go back and pay or make up that payment all at once? Do we have a mechanism that would provide some time?
You know, that's not specifically contemplated in the solid waste management ordinance. Although I think in the spirit of doing the right thing, I think that certainly is an option. I'll tell you that we've worked with this company to the extent that at some point between 2008 and presently, their customer base has dropped from, I guess, about 1,700 customers to about 300. But we don't really know on the sliding scale during that 2-year period when those customer drops have occurred. So to sit here and say they're X number delinquent in infrastructure maintenance fees, I don't know that number because they don't know what their revenues are. And because it's a percentage of revenues, you know, it's easy to say, yeah, we probably owe something, but I don't know what we owe. And I can't answer that question for them. So that's what we've been working on at this point, is identifying exactly how many customers they've had during each of these quarters, so that I know I wouldn't run a business that way either. But that's what we were first up against.
No, just thank you for your efforts and thank you for that update.
Does anyone else have a question for staff? All right. The public hearing is now closed. Is there a motion and a second?
I'll make a motion that we defer agenda item number 10-1140, approval for the removal of Billy Lovelace Hauling from the list of approved solid waste haulers for the city of Milton due to noncompliance with this ordinance until August 16th.
And I'll second the motion.
All right. We currently have a motion to defer until August the 16th, 2010, the removal of Billy Lovelace Hauling from the list of approved solid waste haulers for the city of Milton due to noncompliance with the ordinance. That motion was made by Councilperson Thurman and seconded by Councilperson Zahner Bailey.
Discussion.
Is there any council discussion?
Well, one more question, Chris. Sorry to put it here. We've got a high degree of faith that we can remedy the issues that exist right now. I mean, you know me, I hate to push off making decisions. It doesn't make any sense. If we're really, I mean, but the comment you just made about apparently we don't know what what the revenue is, and therefore assessing them is going to be very, very difficult. It's an unfortunate situation, but how do you fix something like that?
I think as we've been working with them, this is very obviously kind of a home-run business, one-person type show. I think at this point, there's been some professional office staff that's been hired for this company. Apparently, they just have bought a new truck, some of that kind of good stuff. I think we can get close. I think that we're making steps in the right direction. Now, I'll tell you, Council, one of the big reasons, too, why I think it's important that we try, at least at this particular time in place, to work with this company, is we also receive emails because of the nature of this pickup. This is not the big type truck that you see on the roads in the subdivision, but because of the nature of this pickup, it's done in a smaller truck that can navigate driveways, et cetera, in Milton. We have citizens that call us that say, and even has called us today, that say, if you take action on that hauler tonight, I have called the other 14 people on your list, and I can't find anybody to pick up my trash. And that call happens quite frequently as well. So, we're kind of at a crossroads here, almost a double-edged sword, that if we can bring this company into compliance, I think they fit a decent niche in Milton, something that some of the other haulers, nobody else on the list actually does. So, and I think I've heard from several of the council members, at least that your wishes at this point are that we exhaust all of our opportunity to try to make this work before we just throw in the towel and say it doesn't.
They do provide a unique service because they do pick it up at people's houses rather than at the end of the driveway. So for a lot of our elderly population that, would prefer not to have to take their trash cans all the way up and down a long driveway, they do provide that service to them. So it would be nice if they would, obviously they need to comply, but if we can get them to comply, then we may be able to make everybody happy.
Well, I just wanted to point out that our ordinances lose their effect if we just defer these kind of decisions, and that's going to create a problem with collections overall. But if we've got faith that we can, resolve the issue, then I'm okay.
I have faith today that I didn't have a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, when we first put it on the agenda, we couldn't get anybody to talk to us. So I've got renewed faith. I don't want to put it out too far, but we'll see.
Okay.
We've each got some things to commit in the next 6 months.
That's all I needed.
Bill's
Thank you.
In the interest of full disclosure, I use Mr. Lovelace for our collections. It's a legal question. Am I allowed to speak on this issue?
This vendor is used by your business?
No, residents.
Well, you certainly don't need to do anything this evening. I think we have a little bit of time, so we can explore that further, but you can certainly vote in the postpone.
And while you're looking at that, my parents do use them also. So
Yeah, and we use them as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note that they are one of the providers for a rural part of Milton. And I would like to point out, and I think to Joe Longoria, to Councilmember Longoria's point, is that we are now in a mode that we do need to enforce our ordinance, and I think that we all have talked about the importance of that, and so that's why it is a breath of fresh air, Nat, that you and staff are now at the point that we can be enforcing that and understanding who's in compliance and who is not. And I would concur with Councilmember Longoria that we need to be in the business of making sure that we are indeed upholding that ordinance. The good news is it sounds like you guys are working now with this particular provider, and by August 16th, they'll either be in compliance or they won't be. It sounds like you've helped to do them a service, if nothing else, to understand maybe the laws perhaps better than what they had. And so maybe that'll be a template for how we can just ensure that going forward it doesn't take this long to help folks get into compliance. But just thank you for that.
All right. Again, we have a motion to defer until August the 16th, 2010, removal of Billy Lovelace Hauling from the list of approved solid waste haulers for the city of Milton due to noncompliance with the ordinances. Hearing no more discussion, will all those in favor please vote aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. It passes unanimously. Will the clerk please sign the next item?
Next item is approval of alcohol beverage license for Manor Golf Development, LLC, at 5952 Manor Club Drive, Milton, Georgia. The applicant is Riverfront Management, Inc., wine, malt, beverages, and distilled spirits. This is agenda item number 10-1149, originally deferred on June 7th, 2010. Ms. Stacy Inglis, Finance Director.
Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and Council. This item was brought before you, if you recall, the previous meeting. We had to defer it due to an advertising issue. This is simply a change in ownership. The owners have complied with all of the city requirements, and staff recommends approval of this item.
All right. Is there any public comment on this?
No, sir.
And does the council have any questions for staff? All right, we'll now close the public hearing. Is there a motion and a second?
Mayor Pro Tem, I move to approve agenda item 10-1149, an alcohol beverage license for Manor Golf Development LLC at 15952 Manor Club Drive, Milton, Georgia. The
I'll
applicant is Riverfront Management Wine, Malt Beverages, and Distilled Spirits.
I'll second it.
All right, is there any council discussion? Okay, we've got a motion made by Councilperson Park and seconded by Councilperson Thurman to approve the alcohol beverage license for Manor Golf Development LLC at 15952 Manor Club Drive, Milton, Georgia. The applicant is Riverfront Management, Inc., Wine, Malt Beverages, and Distilled Spirits. Agenda item 10-1149. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
Thank you.
It's all passed unanimously. And now the, sorry about that. Public hearing is now closed. Moving on to the zoning agenda, will the city clerk please read the next item?
Next item is RZ 0904, approval of an ordinance to create Article 18 of the City of Milton zoning ordinance to establish a historic preservation commission in the City of Milton to provide for designation of historic properties, to provide for issuance of certificates of appropriateness, to provide for an appeals procedure, to repeal conflicting ordinances, and for other purposes. This is agenda item number 1078, previously discussed at March 8th work session, first presentation on May 17th regular council meeting, public hearing on June 7th, 2010. Ms. Lynn Tully.
Actually, Council, I'm in the mood to interrupt tonight, so I'm going to start this one too. Sorry. Last minute stuff. Let me see if I can maybe recap a little bit about where we have been with this particular ordinance and kind of lay out maybe how the discussion will go tonight, recognizing that this one, at least having seen some of the emails and conversations that I've had, this is one of those that has the potential of quite a bit of discussion tonight, which is fine. Initially, the council created a historic preservation committee. The Historic Preservation Committee was created by resolution, and one of their deliverables, at least that's indicated in that resolution, was to deliver a historic preservation ordinance and other guiding type ideas to the council. Their work product was passed through the Planning Commission, who considered that particular ordinance, made some requests, modifications, suggestions, of which are included in your package. The ordinance was then sent back through the Historic Preservation Committee, who, again, there's just a fundamental, I guess, differing of views as to what both of those committees think should be in this ordinance. And this was before you in the March work session. At the March work session, unfortunately, and I hope it's not happening to us tonight, but that's the one meeting that we have since we've launched Granicus, where Granicus just crapped out. So, that's a technical term. And I don't have Granicus to go back to be able to watch that meeting, but I can tell you that I remember the direction that I got from that meeting, at least the direction that we proceeded with, was that we should take the ordinance, send it through our legal team with our community development director, make it legal, make it look legal, and try to merge as best we could the two recommendations together, and when there was a conflict, to err on the side of including what was the recommendation of the Historic Preservation Committee. That got us to the point that is the ordinance that was presented to you in your packet, one that has what seems to be the issue of debate on this ordinance, has the H historic zoning designation included in it. I have received comment, I have received suggestion, both individually and collectively from several members on council, and I realize that, at least at this point, there was not a position we could get to that would be a legitimate compromise between having either the historic, what we will talk about here in a minute, having the H zoning designation included versus not included. There are polarly opposite viewpoints on whether or not that should be in this ordinance. There's also polarly opposite viewpoints as to whose recommendation should stand in this particular ordinance, whether or not that should be the Historic Preservation Committee's recommendation or some of the thoughts that have come out of the Planning Commission. we're just we're on both ends of the spectrum with those. Having realized that, and I think that we've peeled this thing apart a little bit, realizing that where there is that dispute is over the one section of this particular ordinance that deals with the H zoning designation, which we'll talk about what that means here in a minute. We have presented to you tonight in front of you two different ordinances, one that has it in and one that has it out. That's what you're looking at in front of you. Our city attorney, checked through him. He's okay with us doing that tonight because, in essence, the one that published publicly, the second one that we presented to you tonight is that same ordinance with a section just removed from it, which is a bit different than if we had come to the meeting and tried to add some stuff to the ordinance. So as far as you having an ordinance and then having one that is really part and parcel of the exact same thing with references to the H zoning designation removed. We'll make a staff presentation here as to exactly what the ordinances mean that are in front of you, and certainly answer any questions that you might have. The reason you're seeing two tonight is because I just couldn't get to even a close compromise position. I couldn't even get us from here to here for the purpose of tonight's meeting. We've got people that are still just on both ends of the spectrum. My hope is that by providing both of them to you tonight, we can have a healthy discussion. You all can take action at the end of the night if you want to approve either one or the other, or a modification of one or the other. You could say, we need to talk about this more, let's send it back to a work session in July, or I guess ultimately, as I put in an email over the weekend, I guess you could scrap it all together if you wanted to. I mean, ultimately, you hold that authority. But let us walk through, if you wouldn't mind, let us walk through the one that was published in the packet, and then we'll show you what was removed from the second one that you have, which is kind of a toned-down, pared-down version of the first one. And then we'll see where the discussion goes.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you. Based on the presentation at the last meeting that included the public hearing, a request was sent out for any questions from council. We did receive some questions, not only from council, but from the citizenry as well as planning commission members. And in addressing those, I need to point out to you that the planning commission version of the historic ordinance that's in your packet is the correct version. It is the November 18th, 2009 version. That is included in there, as well as there were questions regarding a lot of requirements, specifically about timeframes. Those are things that have been set out in the state model ordinance and allows us to continue to be eligible for state funding, so we have maintained those same timeframes. There was a question that was brought out regarding an exception for paint color. That has again been included, as well as the undue hardship exception, and that has been included. Again, those things simply make us eligible to continue funding through grants. And so that is what is before you and included as recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission. And that's labeled thusly on your table. You've got two versions, one that says as recommended by Historic Preservation Commission, the other which says removing any reference to the creation of a zoning district. As Mr. Lagerblum mentioned to you, the primary point of discussion was including this historic zoning district as a new base zoning district in reference to the Historic Preservation Ordinance and as a recommendation from the Historic Preservation Ordinance. So the second version removes any reference to creation of that district. Again, we were not able to come together in a single viewpoint regarding this, and therefore we've presented both options. And I know that you all have questions, so I'll be happy to entertain those at this time.
Well, real quick before we go to questions, I think it's obvious that, as the city manager pointed out, that we have some differences of opinions, and that's okay. But I would like for us to keep try to move through this as hearing everything, but move through it as swiftly as possible, and be respectful of each other's viewpoints and times, and try to self-police ourselves with that. So I'll open them up if there are any questions for staff, and I would.
Before you jump into that, could we hear the public comment that we have on this item?
Sure.
Let's get that.
If we'd like to go ahead and open the floor to public comments.
As a point of information, just one question.
Okay.
Just to clarify, because I think we basically have 3 or 4, and I just want to make sure for all of us that we're clear. The packet that we received,
Yes,
that
ma'am.
has a version. Is that the same version as that which is on our desk as recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission?
Yes,
Or-
ma'am, as well as the Planning Commission version from November.
Okay, so that which was in our packet for this week is the same as the one that just happens to now say is recommended by the Planning Commission,
Yes, ma'am.
and still includes the historic zoning designation, but had some of the things that you and Ken had collectively modified, including, as you just referenced, the paint and the undue hardship. I just want to make sure that those two are the same.
Yes,
They're
ma'am.
just labeled differently.
They are the same.
You just said planning commission, I think you
I'm
meant.
so sorry, I did, thank you. Therein lies the point, that there's so many
Yeah.
different versions. Okay, so what's in our packet, and one of the two before us this evening was the same.
And
Yes,
the one
ma'am.
is the same as recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission.
Commission, but that's the one that does still include the zoning and potentially some reference to prior use.
Yes.
Thank you for that clarity.
Tim, I have a question. On that, in that same vein, looking at the different versions, I was looking at the version that we were looking at 2 weeks ago, when we had this as, for public hearing, and the language is different from that one. I mean, it wasn't that we just deleted sections. The sections that we deleted don't have the same language as the one that was in our packet 2 weeks ago. Because, like, for instance,
I'll have to ask you which version, sir. I'm sorry.
okay, this would be like section 3C3, and again, maybe this is a lesson to us as we go forward, that we need to start putting headers and footers to these different versions, because who knows what version this is. But this is the version that was in our packet from the Historic Preservation Committee 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
And that particular language, like for instance, and I'm sure if I go through here, it's going to be the same for all of these different sections, but section 3C3 said, the HPC shall be authorized to consider for approval proposals and recommendations for possible zoning of property to the historic zoning designation as provided for in section blah, 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 based on prior use and otherwise in accord with requirements of the historic H zoning designation, blah, blah, blah. Well, the version that we have this week for consideration that is supposedly from the Historic Preservation Commission doesn't have anything about his prior use.
Yes, and that was based on the comments that we received at the public hearing. At the public hearing, there was much deliberation regarding including that, and particularly in consultation with the city attorney, and including the prior use as a reference for that historic zoning designation. So we took all the references to that out.
Okay, so then, as recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission, just to make sure I'm clear, is everything that was recommended by them, including the paint color and undue hardship, including the historic zoning designation, but without any reference to prior use.
Yes, sir.
And this other one that we have, which is removal of any reference, has all of the above except for it takes out the historic zoning designation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to scrap all this other stuff.
All right, well, if we would go ahead now and take public comments. Are there any public comments, City Clerk?
Yes, sir. We have 4 public comments. The first I will read into the record. It's from Mindy Freeman of 14120 Phillips Circle, Milton, Georgia, 30004. She was unable to make the meeting tonight, but I will read for her. Dear Mayor, City Council members, City Manager, and staff, we have been residents of Northwest Fulton County, now City of Milton, for 24 years. And we have been both pleased and concerned about the many changes that have taken place in this area we call home. We are blessed to be surrounded by many historic farms and structures, some yet to be discovered. The citizens expect the City Council to protect our history and rural environment. We love the special environment of Milton, but it must be protected for future generations. That is why we are very troubled by a proposed ordinance now before the council regarding prior use as a basis for rezoning an historic structure, a structure that at one time had a non-residential use, but is now in a location where such a use is not allowed, should not be allowed to convert back to a non-residential use simply because the building may be historic. If a landowner or applicant wants to pursue a rezoning, then they have the ability and right to do so through a typical rezoning process. Historic preservation and zoning are separate issues and should not be combined into one ordinance. The citizens of Milton want to preserve historic structures, but not at the cost of imposing a non-conforming use on an area that was not intended for non-residential use. We reviewed this when it came before the Planning Commission and supported their removal of any reference to zoning. However, we are now concerned that zoning has been reinserted into the ordinance. The draft ordinance on the Milton website also refers to an historic zoning district, but provides no details as to what this is or what this could become. We find this troublesome. Please allow the current zoning process to remain as it is now and keep historic preservation and rezoning separated. Please protect our beautiful city of Milton by ensuring that any historic preservation ordinance does not include anything tied to zoning and remove any references to prior use and historic zoning designations. Thank you. Mindy Freeman. Our next public comment comes from Joan Borzilleri.
Good evening. Joan Borzilleri, 540 Kings County Court, Milton, Georgia. I'm a member of the Historic Preservation Committee, but I'm speaking tonight as a private citizen. You have the two versions of the Historic Preservation Ordinance before you this evening. I respectfully request that you approve the one without the Historic District Zoning designation. Historic District Zoning introduces complexity and the potential for unintended consequences into the zoning process. It can result in commercial encroachment into residential areas currently zoned AG1. It is not in the Department of Natural Resources sample version of the ordinance, and it was voted down by the Planning Commission and the Design Review Board. Please vote against this version of the ordinance and support the existing zoning process. Thank you.
Our next public comment comes from George Ragsdale.
I don't have a script to read. I'd like to start by trying to get clarification, as all of you would.
George, can you do name and address again?
Sorry, George Ragsdale, 540 Trayburn View. Apologize.
Do we need a script?
There were two packages sent out, one that was supposedly for the June 7th meeting. It was indicated as a letter dated May 5th. There was another package sent out as indicated for the June 21st meeting, also with a letter dated May 5th. There are significant differences both in the letter. There are significant differences in the ordinances that were attached. I would like to understand, since both of them say that they represent final versions approved by the Historic Preservation Committee on March 3rd, when all these additional changes that have been discussed were reviewed and approved by the Historic Preservation Committee.
Well, why don't you go ahead and finish your comment?
Okay. There are several significant issues, and I've got 2 pages worth of comments, most of which are construction issues that I don't need to raise tonight. But clearly the primary issue for me is that what was sent out in the packet and what you have before you is a version of the ordinance that was proposed by the Planning Commission back in November of last year. To the best of my knowledge, the council has not considered that ordinance or looked at that ordinance. The ordinance the council has looked at is an ordinance that was put forward by the Historic Preservation Committee. To me, that is inconsistent with the process and the laws that are on the books for the city of Milton. There is no provision that allows for an ad hoc committee to bring forth an ordinance outside of the process of a CZIM and Planning Commission and bring it to the City Council. So to the best of my knowledge, the City Council has not considered the ordinance that was put forth by the Planning Commission. Number 2, the addition, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Planning Commission, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, but I want to contrast what I think are the key differences, not between the 2 Historic Preservation Committee ordinances, but between the Planning Commission ordinance, the one proposed by the Planning Commission, and the ordinance proposed by the Historic Preservation Committee. We've already talked about one, as have others, and that's the inclusion of the historic zoning district. The second one has to do with the inclusion of historic district as opposed to historic properties. The way the Historic Preservation Committee's ordinance is written, it provides for a historic district that can include properties that are now, in the latest version of the ordinance, potentially classified as contributory and non-contributory. It's a good idea. I think it came from the state ordinance, but the ordinance that's before you does not carry that through to its ultimate conclusion. It requires non-contributory properties to go through the same process of obtaining certificates of appropriateness before they can make material alterations to their properties. To me, that is inappropriate. Designating an area as historic is a good idea. If what you're trying to do is to promote that area as historic, I'm all for that. I know in prior conversations that one of the goals was to be able to post signs that says this is historic Crabapple or this is historic Birmingham or whatever. But including properties that are not historic and subjecting them to a higher standard with respect to what they can do with their property, to me, is inappropriate. And the ordinance that's before you has that requirement. The second thing that is just troubling to me is the level of authority that's granted to the Historic Preservation Commission by this ordinance. Not only do they have the authority to modify design guidelines without any oversight, which to me is troublesome, they have the authority to waive requirements of the ordinance if the commission feels that the property owner would suffer undue economic hardship. I'm all for having an undue hardship clause in this ordinance, but giving the Historic Preservation Committee the right to waive, we just got through. You just got through talking
1 minute
about
remaining.
You just got through talking about enforcement of ordinances with respect to trash hauling. I don't think you want to give a committee that is established as an ad hoc committee or a committee that's established by this ordinance the authority to waive requirements that are in the ordinance that you have approved. I recommend that you defer this for 60 days. I believe you should follow the process that's set out in the city ordinances as currently established, and let the Planning Commission, if the Planning Commission wants to meet again with, or if the Historic Preservation Commission wants to meet again with the Planning Commission, absolutely should do that. I believe that we can work through to the point of having a single ordinance to bring it forward, but right now you've got two that are very different in scope.
Our final comment comes from Paul Moore.
Good evening. I'm Paul Moore. I live at 15290 White Columns Drive, Milton. I would also like to clarify, as George may have done earlier this evening, I'm a member of the Planning Commission, but I'm speaking solely on my as a citizen this evening. I share some of the same concerns that came before you this evening, and some of the questions that arose because of what appeared to be some conflict in the two ordinances that were put before you. Because that was unclear, I just made a couple of prepared remarks that address two items in particular, so you'll hear the clarification in a second. The Planning Commission put forward a comprehensive document at the conclusion of more than 10 hours of work, including time spent with Mr. Ken Gerard, Milton City Attorney, in a special called meeting. That is not being considered tonight. I'm troubled that as you consider a new ordinance that addresses zoning issues, the Planning Commission, the body created to be the zoning recommending entity for the mayor and council, is being taken out of the process and basically creates two bodies doing the same work that could be in conflict. I believe any and all language in the current draft that pertains to any zoning-related item, ordinance change, or process should be removed. To do anything less would be in direct conflict with our established laws and procedures regarding our adopted zoning procedures. The document you had tonight also introduces a prior use clause. The Planning Commission specifically voted by unanimous decision to remove any reference to the prior use clause, and I encourage you to remove the same this evening. It is nothing more than an end around to our zoning process. The document you have before you tonight also creates a new special zoning designation, the historic zoning designation, a designation that does not even have a definition offered for consideration tonight. It's clearly a case of rushing to conclusion before having all the details worked out. I strongly urge you not to pass the ordinance tonight. Please defer it. and send it back to the Planning Commission for additional work and a chance to fill in the blanks of what is currently missing and a chance to ensure you don't create an ordinance that is in conflict with our current zoning process. If you feel you must proceed tonight, please remove all language that addresses the prior use clause and the undefined historic zoning designation. Thank you.
That's all the comments, sir.
All right, just as Ken, we kind of skipped any questions for staff. I think we had a couple of questions. Do we need to go back to that before we close the public public hearing and take that up as discussion?
I think we can go ahead and close the public hearing because at this point, I think the same effect will be there.
Well, the public hearing is now closed. And again, perhaps we'll start down with Councilperson Thurman and work our way this way. If we've got any things that want to be brought up, and try to maintain our discussion in a professional manner.
It's my understanding that anything that would be rezoned to this new H category would have to go before the Planning Commission and the City Council, and it would be a full rezoning process that would conform to our current standards.
Yes, ma'am.
And it's my understanding y'all have not written that yet, which I believe is, you should not write it until you know there's something that needs to be written. I don't want our staff wasting time writing a zoning classification when you don't even know for sure that we're going to have that zoning classification. But y'all have not actually written that classification yet.
That's correct.
And once that classification is written, it would have to be approved by it would go through it would be a change to our zoning ordinance, so it would go through the Planning Commission and then to the City Council for approval.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. There were some questions as far as the conforming and non-conforming. Are you comfortable with the language that's in there concerning when properties would have to conform and which ones would not?
Yes, ma'am. I believe the question was contributing or non-contributing structures in a historic district. There is a little bit of an additional requirement for those structures that are non-contributing that fall within a historic district. They would have to appear before the Design Review Board, not before the Historic Preservation Commission, but before the Design Review Board. I believe the Design Review Board is comfortable with hearing those, and that's simply put in there as a protection to the other buildings that are in the historic district and are contributing, such that changes to those particular buildings don't have a detrimental effect on the historic value of any of the other buildings.
So you're comfortable
in that
with the way
area.
it is currently
Yes,
written
ma'am.
now to understand that's clear for those that would come forward?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You took out the prior use, the words prior use were taken out of here. But I'm assuming that in order for a building to get this new H zoning classification, it would first have to be approved by the Historic Planning Commission, then it would have to go through a rezoning with the Planning Commission, and then it would have to come through the City Council. So it's not bypassing any steps, it's just really an additional step with the Historic Planning Commission.
Yes, ma'am. They would have to have a recommendation from the Historic Preservation Commission prior to being heard by the Planning Commission, and that's how it's intended to be written at this point.
And at that time, then, things could not be zoned to this new category that had not been historic. So it's not a way to get a zoning that it would not be, that would be inappropriate for the area because it had never been that in the past. So you couldn't just take an old house and suddenly decide you're going to make a store out of it if it had never been anything but an old house.
At this point, we haven't written the district, and my best guess at this point is that would be a correct statement. But again, we haven't written the district, and I don't want to presuppose any uses. In fact, that's why the prior use requirement reference was taken out. We don't want to presuppose any of the requirements of this new zoning district at this time.
And it's true that, when I first got involved with Fulton County in the historic process 15 years ago, we've lost over half the structures that we had on our initial historic map for Fulton County, for the inventory map. So we've got to find some way to really preserve them. What we really want to do is preserve the historic structures, and we've got to find some way to be able to preserve them so that they aren't allowed just to deteriorate to the point that they're no longer worth anything. Do you feel comfortable with this ordinance and that it would help preserve the historic structures that we have?
Yes,
in the
ma'am, it
city?
will help preserve the historic structures that currently exist in Milton.
Okay.
Councilman Summer, I just want to make one point of clarification. It may just have been y'all were speaking about two different. With respect to the recommendation to the H zoning designation, on page 9, it can, of course, that recommendation can come from the council, can come from the Historic Preservation Committee or Commission, but also could come from a historical society, neighborhood association, or the property owner. I just wanted to clarify that.
But regardless of who it came from, it would have to go through the Planning Commission as a rezoning with all the public hearings and all that a typical rezoning would have.
Specifically called out, that would be the case.
But it's just one extra step because it has to be recommended from one of these groups. Okay,
Is that all you have, Karen?
that's it for now.
All right. Councilperson Honor Bailey.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We obviously had dialogue about this a little bit 2 weeks ago. First of all, I just want to be very clear. I support historic preservation. I've been a historic preservationist for a very long time, helping to make sure that those that have been part of this Fulton County inventory for the last 24 years, that we've done everything possible to keep them from being demolished. And I'm proud to say that many of those that have not been demolished have been in large part because of my efforts. And we have lost some, and so we need to make sure that we protect them. My concerns tonight and my questions are the fact that in the midst of preserving our historic buildings and sites, that we don't, as we've heard from members of our planning commission and the community and in other emails and things from other citizens, that we don't set in motion some unintended consequences. I think probably if we asked all of us tonight, we'd say we all support historic preservation. You know, what's not to support? I think that I heard very clearly articulated, and I appreciate the comments of tonight because it does help give me some clarity when I think about where we are. And thank you to the city manager and to Lynn for trying to help summarize that. But thank you also for the clarity of the comments of Mr. Ragsdale and other citizens. It really does seem that right now we've got two sections that cause some trouble, that cause trouble for the Design Review Board, that have caused some concerns and consternation from the Planning Commission unanimously. We've heard from citizens and members of the HPC that the reference to a zoning designation is not part of a staff, but part of the state model. I know that the DRB and the Planning Commission both unanimously had removed any reference to zoning designation, whether that was prior use or this historic zoning designation. And I'd also like, Lynn, I know we've had some dialogue, if you could speak to, and I know you just answered a question that specifically said, would this ordinance as written help to preserve the history? But could you also speak to, kind of from your professional perspective, two things. One, are you aware of any zoning categories being part of other historic preservation ordinances that you're familiar with? I guess that would be question number one. And then the second question is that in your professional involvement in zoning, et cetera, if you were helping to write this ordinance, would you have a historic zoning designation and reference to prior use within the historic preservation document, or would you keep that separate and keep that part of zoning?
All right, addressing the first question, in Georgia, I have not seen a prior use or other historic reference to a zoning district for a base zoning district. That doesn't mean it can't happen. I just haven't seen one. I don't think there is one in Georgia. I would be surprised. As far as if I were to have planned this in a vacuum, meaning, no committees, no planning commission, start from scratch, it probably would look different. There would probably be some changes, particularly in regards to how it's handled in the zoning ordinance. That doesn't mean that this is wrong or illegal in any way. It simply means I would have done it a little differently. Would I have handled it separately? Probably, as a separate issue, but that, again, in deference to the work that this committee has done and the effort that they have put into it, I would say that this is a valid document.
And again, my question is not really about the validity. It was more a function of good ordinance structure, and in terms of keeping processes, as we've heard from Mr. Ragsdale and Mr. Moore and others, I think the question is, where does this belong? Where does part of it belong? And I think what I've heard you just say is that if you were helping to construct this, you would have kept the zoning portions within zoning. I know that that's what you've said to me, obviously, separately, and that's what I think I heard you politely and professionally restate here this evening. And of course, with all due respect, I think all of us appreciate all the work that everybody has put into this document to date. And none of these questions call into question those efforts. It simply says now that this document is before us, what's the best structure based on the input from the various entities, including the HPC, including the Design Review Board, including the Planning Commission, including the state model, including our staff, because I think that we need to make sure that we don't presume that you haven't been involved, because you are now involved, thank goodness. And I think that we need to not ignore the fact that if you were creating this, you've stated that you would not have kept zoning within the historic preservation, but you would have separated them. And I think that that's also what I've heard here tonight from some of the citizens, but also from members who are speaking individually, but members of our Planning Commission. And again, it's not to say that the Planning Commission wouldn't and couldn't consider creating a historic zoning designation, but it's that this document tonight, I think, sets in motion some risk if we do that without that already defined. And so I would support either deferring, as has been suggested by Mr. Ragsdale and others, so that the HPC and the Planning Commission can remedy those areas. And a question, and if I may, and if it's appropriate from a procedural standpoint, Mr. Ragsdale, would you just come up and just restate, I think I heard you say, that you believe that there was an opportunity, most probably in 60 days, for the HPC and for you guys to come together and really resolve those places where it's different and where there's a question. Because I think I heard you say that you had, I'll use a phrase, high confidence, but that you guys could come together and have one document versus having 4 versions. May I ask that question?
We're debating that right now, because George is here tonight speaking as a citizen.
But I'm asking him as an applicant. If he was an applicant, I'm asking him as a citizen. Okay, how can I rephrase my question? I'll just ask him to restate what he said earlier.
Well, if we're restating what we've already said, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah, public hearings closed.
Right, but we often can ask citizens that have spoken. So I'm going to ask George Ragsdale as a citizen to just clarify. I believe I heard you say as a citizen that you felt it would be possible to have the HPC members join with the Planning Commission members, whether that includes you or not, to help resolve and rectify some of these differences.
I really don't care to get into a back and forth between the audience and us, but if it's admissible, we can ask one quick question and then let's get on with this thing.
I think that's fine for clarification.
Okay.
I mean, it's consistent with our zoning procedures.
Just
Thank
let
you.
Mr. Ragsdale, real quick, please.
As a private citizen, I don't have an opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so and again, for the record, it's under the zoning item. It's quite appropriate that we ask those who have spoken before to clarify. I believe it sets in motion some unintended consequences, in particular when we have a historic zoning designation that's not even defined. I think that's troubling. I would also ask that when we consider historic preservation, that the comments that were also made with regards to contributory and non-contributory, and I'll just speak to the Birmingham Crossroads as an example. I think some of the businesses that exist in that area, obviously some of those structures are new. I think it's a valid point that there could be some concern as to whether a new structure within the confines of an area that may be in totality historic, that they would perhaps have to adhere to standards that previously they didn't have to adhere to. And again, it's one thing to adhere to the master plan and the overlays, but I think it could be troubling from a contributory versus non-contributory. So I think that that's something that, again, I just very honestly don't believe has been ferreted out or vetted out as thoroughly as it needs to be. Doesn't mean that we couldn't have something really solid here shortly. I also thought that it was valid, the comments that were brought up about concern over authority with regards to waiver. And could staff please speak to that section? To think that we would have an ordinance, but then we would have a committee or a commission that could then waive those without any oversight. Can you speak to which section of the document that Mr. Ragsdale referenced?
That would be section G under section 5, letter G, undue hardship.
Which version?
Either.
Okay, section 5.
Either of the two with the red lettering on top.
Okay, Section 5.
Section 5, letter G, undue hardship. And it does state that the commission, in a specific instance of extreme economic hardship or practical difficulty, may waive some of the requirements of this ordinance.
And I would like to just speak to that, and for consideration of everybody on this council, is that one, what would be the measurement of financial hardship? That's not been defined. It becomes a subjective sort of reference. And it would be hard for me to ignore the comments that were made into the record earlier this evening, that that's troubling. Again, it's not that those that would be on that commission aren't very talented and able people, but that from an authority standpoint, as it relates to our ordinances, to put ordinances in place that then could have segments of those waived by a separate entity is troubling. And I appreciate the fact that that was brought to the attention of everybody this evening, because I don't think that that would be appropriate. It would be inconsistent with what we've done in other ordinances. So I just ask that everybody on this body give careful consideration to that. I personally would like to see that modified. As it relates to timeframes, and this is a secondary issue, my primary concern is with the prior use as well as with the historic zoning designation, first and foremost, contributory and non-contributory, and then finally the point about the ability of an HPC commission being able to waive those rights. I did pose a few questions to you earlier about the timeframes with regards to advertisement, as well as if someone wanted to appeal a decision of the HPC. My question had to do with whether or not those timeframes were adequate. They seem to be somewhat short. Could you just speak to that? And again, this would be in the instance of a citizen that had a decision given, whether for or against. It seemed that that citizen or business wouldn't have ample time to respond to an appeal. I think the appeal was about 15 days. You know, if somebody's out of town for, a week and a half, they get back and suddenly they don't have an opportunity to appeal. Could you just speak to that?
Yes, ma'am. Those timeframes were taken straight from the state's model ordinance,
Okay.
and they are the minimum timeframes. If you so choose to relax those standards or allow them to have a longer time frame, then you're welcome to do so.
And just for the benefit of council, I would just point to, again, I hope that the page numbers are still accurate, but those were, as an example, on page 14, it talked about if 45 days passes with no response, there would be an automatic approval. That troubled me a little bit, because sometimes I know that our committees sometimes have difficulty with the quorum, but I was more troubled by, it's on page 15, where it says time for a property owner to appeal was only 15 days, and I was just concerned that we wouldn't want to have a property owner lose their right to appeal if they happen to be out of town. So that, again, was something that I thought was worthy of consideration. And the final comment was with regards to creating or modifying design guidelines. Could you speak to that, Lynn, if you would? It concerns me that a separate entity would be able to modify design guidelines. Again, I think the more collaborative, the better, because we end up with a better end result. But can you speak to whether or not a separate committee would be able to modify design guidelines through their authority?
That's the intent of the undue hardship clause, is to allow a modification of a variance, if you will, for specific items, again, that would not harm the intent of the area and would continue to preserve the architectural integrity, but would allow for deviations from the design guidelines.
And again, this would be, I think as we heard from those citizens that commented, is that it would be without any oversight, and that's troubling. What would be an alternative approach? As an example, let's say somebody wanted to claim undue hardship under the current language, and rather than to have a separate entity that historically hasn't had that authority, what would be an alternative? Would it be to have that come back for consideration either by the Planning Commission or this body, so that we didn't simply just have waivers occurring without some sort of approval process?
Those typically would go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, but again, that particular section comes straight from the model ordinance and was recommended to us by the state so that we can maintain our eligibility for additional grant funding.
And I'll just point out that we're now talking about things that are highlighted in the state model. It's inconsistent in my perspective that in some regards we want to say that we're going to reference the state model, and yet two of the biggest things, prior use and a historic zoning designation, in particular the historic zoning designation, is not recommended by the state model at all. So I would suggest that if we're going to lean towards the state model, we should be consistent in that. And so just to recap quickly, my concerns are those that were stated this evening, I think quite well by those citizens and others with regards to leaving historic zoning designation, set that aside out of this document, as well as come up with some alternative language with regards to the waiver authority. That's troubling, as well as being able to modify design guidelines, and then also the need to address the contributory versus non-contributory. And I know that we're all wanting to get this in place. I'd say that it would be hard for me to ignore the request of Mr. Ragsdale, which was to consider a deferral of 60 days so that well-intended folks that have worked hard, both Planning Commission and the HPC, to come together and come up with one document versus 5 different versions. That seems reasonable, and I think right now in this economy we don't tend to have a lot of risk of demolition, and because the DRB can stay some of those demolitions, 60 days seems like a very minimal risk and a great opportunity for folks to come together that have been extremely well-intended. So I'd like to ask us to consider that request that was put forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilperson West.
I wish, if you would, please, Lynn, clarify again, does the state model address historic zoning designation?
No, sir, it does not.
Is there anything in the state model that would closely address an historic designation?
I don't believe so, sir.
Pardon me. Back in 2004, 2005 time frame, Fulton County conducted a survey of historic structures in northwest Fulton County. Jessica Lavendier with Fulton County spearheaded that. Councilmember Thurman was in that process. At that time, I believe there was something in a range of about 100 structures.
I think 196, sorry.
In that survey. Are you familiar with that?
I have seen the book. Yes, sir.
Okay. Your best estimate, how many of those structures would you say are still existing today?
You know, I don't know that I could really answer that question, sir. Potentially one of the committee members might be able to answer it better.
Does a committee person know?
40 tops. But that 196 has got to do the entire northwest Fulton County, including Johns Creek, Alpharetta, Roswell, Milton.
Correct, but I was just referring to the fact that that document was 196, so that we're all clear which document we're referencing.
I guess my point is these structures are disappearing rapidly. And I noticed while I was on the Northwest Fulton Design Review Board and reviewing uses for some of these structures disappeared overnight because they didn't, the owners were not willing to comply with some of the stringent conditions that were placed on them. Has the Planning Commission developed a designation or a description for a historic district or a historic site?
Not at this time, sir.
Nothing of any sort?
Not anything that would be outside of what we have seen in these versions.
In Article 5, well, it's actually 4D. D, Delta, point 2, the approval process. It appears to me, or my interpretation, is that the designation comes of historic, or an H designation comes solely from Historic Preservation Committee or City Council. It doesn't, there's no process stated here where it goes in front of the Planning Commission for approval. Is that correct?
No, sir. In
Does it-
Section 2B, the section which states the property owner shall follow the process for rezoning as established by Article 28 of the zoning ordinance. That is where the Planning Commission would come in.
Okay, so really, ultimately, the decision is with the planning commission. Would you agree with that?
Well, there's a recommendation to you all from the Planning Commission, and yes, the decision would then lie with you all,
Okay.
as with any other zoning.
Those are the questions I have.
Okay. I'll go on with a couple of things I've got. As far as the currently non-existent H zoning classification, we could craft that, and it could be as tight or as non-tight as we like. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. I have to agree with Councilperson Zonner Bailey on some thoughts about the hardship and the variance process with that. I would perhaps rather see that maybe lie with us as a council, not to take anything away from our yet to be established Historic Preservation Commission. My other thought would be is, could you kind of, and maybe you have a little bit already, but what is the significance of the removal of the prior use in either one of these documents?
In discussions with the city attorney and others, we felt like even mentioning prior use presupposed that condition on the zoning district, whereas we wouldn't necessarily do that with another ordinance. That's kind of atypical. And so what we did was remove that, replace it with language that basically said it needed to contribute to the historic value of the area.
Okay, thank you. I know everybody's worked, very diligently on this, whether it be the Preservation Committee or the Planning Commission. I'm not sure that we perhaps haven't reached a point of going backwards instead of forwards. I'm not sure a deferral is going to get us any closer. I wish that we could all come up here and everybody agree on everything and it move forward. I would like to see this move forward. I think we've been debating this for a long time, but I think it's only fair to let everybody have their comments and keep going forward. So that's all I've got at this point. Councilperson Longoria.
Yeah. Lynn, do you know when the Historic Preservation Committee was created? Or maybe I could ask one of the members in the audience if they could just shout out when it was created.
I believe it was in 2007.
Yeah. Yeah, so the committee has been working on this for 2 years, 2.5 years. So, in terms of being quick or rushing to decisions, I don't really think that qualifies. We've been working on this for a while. And there's been a lot of hard work that's gone into this by the Historic Preservation Committee. And we created that committee specifically to do a job. And the job that we created for them was to come up with an ordinance that would cover this if one was worthy of consideration. And these guys put a lot of time and effort into that. Now, why didn't we ask the Planning Committee our commission to do that? Well, because this is a subset of the work that they do. And it was a big enough subset or important enough subset for us to give it special treatment, to focus somebody's efforts on that for a certain period of time. So why we're sitting here today, June in 2010, and worried about the fact that we're rushing to create an ordinance that we need to consider more is sort of beyond me, because I think we put quite a bit of consideration into this. And I'd like to thank the folks on the Historic Preservation Committee to getting that job done. So what's confusing me at this point in time is why 2 documents, right? I'm the new guy. I hadn't been around very long, but I've never seen this done. I've never seen us vote on something and say, you know what, if you don't like this one, let's vote on this one. If you don't like this one, let's vote on this one. I'm confused because what we should have done was allow the Historic Preservation Committee to present us with a document. Either we liked it or we didn't. We either voted up or we voted down. I don't understand the smorgasbord of options here, and it's a little bit confusing. So I don't think we're doing the HPC a service by doing that. It's almost like we're saying, you know, you guys did an awfully good job, but you know what? There was another guy in the class, he took good notes, and we might consider his version of this instead. And I don't think that that's fair. I want to point out that nothing automatically happens if we vote on either one of these versions of an ordinance. It's not like tomorrow all of a sudden there's going to be 60 historic districts defined or 60 properties defined that have historic significance. That's one of the interesting things about historic preservation. They have to be, something has to happen for them to actually be historic. You just can't call yourself historic. Although at some point in time the President of the United States will have come from Milton, and his house, maybe it was built in 2007, will become historic, even though it's new. So I'm a little confused again with why we pitted these two groups against one another. It seems like that the guys on the Planning Commission are a little bit worried about some of the things that are going into this, but really we need to vote on this in terms of the merits of what the Historic Preservation Committee put together, and either vote that up or vote that down. I'm not concerned about the lack of definition of the historic zoning itself, because that's very common in a top-down approach to this kind of stuff. It's the exact reason why we have gaps in our ordinances today. The numbers aren't filled in from 1 to 10. They skip some. Why is that? So we can insert some stuff later that we don't know about. So the fact that we get an opportunity, once this is passed, to consider how we need to deal with historic zoning itself, I think is a good thing. And I don't think it requires that we know everything in advance, because if we were to wait for that day to come around, this would never get voted on. So there weren't a lot of questions in there, was there? Other than when was the committee created, but those are the things I wanted to make sure got on the record, and that's the way I feel about it right now.
All right. Mr. Stark.
All right. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the members of the Historic Preservation Committee for your efforts. Also, the Planning Commission for your review of the original draft. There appears to be some confusion, and maybe I'm confused as well. And I'll address this very systematically in my mind. The original draft Planning Commission, the original draft Historic Preservation Ordinance from the Historic Preservation Committee included reference to prior use. It did not include a historic designation, zoning designation, correct?
It did.
It did. Okay, and the Planning Commission reviewed it? That's what I thought.
The one from
Okay.
March the 3rd included a historic zoning district.
I think council members talking about the one even in 09.
Ah,
back
I'm
in
sorry.
09, which did not.
In 09, the one that you were scheduled to hear in December did not.
Okay.
But it did include extensive prior use allowances.
Okay, and so there was a subsequent draft of that went back before the Planning Commission and was reviewed that included the prior use and included the zoning designation, historic zoning designation. And the Planning Commission voted at that time 7-0 to not include either of those, correct?
I don't believe it included a historic zoning designation. It only included the prior use.
That's what I'm confused on, because there's been several comments that have been made by this body and perhaps even some members of the chamber that said that the Planning Commission had reviewed and considered a historic zoning designation, and they voted not to accept that. I in all these versions, I'm not getting where that was reviewed or ever considered by the Planning Commission, correct?
The historic zoning district version came from additional discussion that was had offline and was brought forward as recommendations to the Historic Preservation Committee.
Correct.
And that language was
in my interpretation
approved
of
by
what
the committee.
happened, the Planning Commission reviewed a draft. That draft did not include historic zoning designation. Subsequent to that meeting and the recommendations that came out of the Planning Commission, the Historic Preservation Committee added back into the draft ordinance that we're reviewing tonight, a new historic zoning designation, correct? Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They pulled out all the prior use reference and allowances and then added in place of those this historic zoning
Okay,
district.
So I just want to be clear with that because I have a few questions and then I have some comments. Are there any other zoning designations in our zoning ordinance for which we've already gone ahead and said this is a certain designation, but we're going to define it later?
We do that in some of our other committees. CPAC, for instance, will have a recommendation for different zoning districts to be created in compliance with implementation of the comprehensive plan. This contemplates a historic zoning district for implementation of historic preservation. Again, with CPAC, it's a little bit different. They're charged with specifically land use type criteria. This is charged with primarily historic preservation criteria. So,
because I see a big difference here, because when this becomes law, I know that subsequent that several members of this body have pointed out that we can come up with the criteria for the historic zoning designation, and we can define how it's to be used and whatnot. What I'm having confusion with is the fact that, and then in the same vein, people are saying, well, it will come back to the Historic Planning Commission. There'll be a recommendation made to the Planning Commission. Then we will make the ultimate decision on whether something becomes historic or not. The problem I'm having with that is if we haven't even defined what that historic designation is going to be, how can anyone, any of the above, make any kind of recommendation one way or the other on anything? Because we haven't even defined what that is yet. It's like we're putting the cart before the horse. Why on earth would we possibly pass something into law that should be implemented tomorrow, where these three bodies should consider something when they have no clue how to make that consideration? What do they use? If somebody wants to come before us now and rezone from AG1 to C1, there are things in our zoning ordinance that addresses that.
Well, Councilmember Tartt, let me try that one. I think the answer to your question is that there will be no applications and consideration to the zoning designation until it is in place. So until the actual zoning designation is created and lawfully adopted by this council, no one can seek an zoning designation.
Okay. Next question. With regard to undue hardship, and it's been expressed by members of this board as well, that there was some angst with that. I'm having a hard time understanding how the commission itself would have the sole authority to waive requirements of the ordinance, but yet these have to come before that same body through a rezoning. A recommendation would be made from that body to the planning commission, which we ultimately decide. How can on one hand they waive certain requirements of the ordinance and on the other hand make recommendations that we ultimately have to decide? How would all that work?
I'll take that one. Primarily, it's the authority for the Historic Preservation Commission lies in the issuance of these certificates of appropriateness. The certificates are based on aesthetic guidelines, these design guidelines. They're not based on use or setbacks or anything like that. They're based on these aesthetic type guidelines. The model ordinance for the state was created for places where zoning may not even be in existence and there may not even be a Board of Zoning Appeals. Here we do have one, but the model ordinance allows for the commission themselves to monitor themselves in maintaining the integrity of that district. So yes, in this particular case, they would be allowed to waive their design guidelines, that aesthetic criteria, if they found a specific undue hardship or extreme economic hardship. It would still have to be something that they didn't create themselves, a situation that wasn't created by the applicant. But it's almost a quasi-BZA issue. I don't know that... Again, I don't know that the BZA would be averse to hearing any of those issues, but it's simply not written that way in the state model ordinance, and has been recommended by the state historic preservation planner that we maintain that same language. So,
And I apologize for my remaining confusion, but herein lies my confusion. The BZA is completely separate from us. Once we hear rezoning, if there is a need to deviate from the requirements in our zoning ordinance, they can go before the BZA to get a variance. Or if it's brought in conjunction with the rezoning, then it would be a concurrent variance. That's all clear to me. But what we have here is that a committee who's making recommendations to the Planning Commission and on to the council, making recommendations for even making something historic in this ordinance, has the sole authority to waive requirements of the ordinance. How does that work?
Councilman Turner, are you referencing their ability to recommend a historic zoning, and you're questioning their interplay with that process? Because
how does that work with them being able to waive requirements of the ordinance?
The H zoning designation will be a separate ordinance. I don't believe they're going to have a variance power with respect to the H zoning.
Right.
That is wholly separate. This ordinance will set up, act as the precursor, the catalyst, the trigger, if you will, for the creation of that. But it's not going to be the Historic Preservation Commission's charge to grant variances with respect to those zonings that are the byproduct of this. That will be handled in the ordinary course through either the Planning Commission or the council or the BZA. But see, what the language on the undue hardship says.
Yeah, tell me how Section 5G would be.
When, by reason, the strict application of any provision of this ordinance, this one we have right here, and this one we have right here, does not actually create the H zoning designation.
But it contemplates that, does it not?
It does contemplate it. It does contemplate it, but it's not created yet, and that will not provide the HPC the power to grant variances with respect to that future ordinance that has not been created yet.
Do we know that for certain based on this language, or we're saying that we think in the future when that language is defined, we're hopeful that it won't?
I think it absolutely says that, because it says that they only have the power to grant variances with respect to this ordinance.
And I guess that is that question of what this ordinance includes. And I know that right now it doesn't yet define that language. And forgive me for jumping on this question, so afraid I'll forget. But if we will, before you get off of that, Councilmember Tart, if we can clarify what undue hardship actually applies to, because I know I'll forget to ask this question later since we're on that topic. Because I think I heard you guys say it applies to design, but I don't see it saying that.
Yeah, I guess that's where I'm confused.
Well, I think to Councilmember Zarnavelli's point, I mean, I think that at the bottom of page 13 it says the strict application of any provision of this ordinance. So I don't know that it's necessarily limited to design either. I think you've got two things going against you. I think two things compounding to create this. One is an intent to do the best we can to emulate the model code. Quite frankly, I think that's why it's in there at all. And then, secondly, the fact that we have this other ordinance contemplated, and that's created some confusion. I know, in Councilmember Tar, I understand your question.
Okay. Let's see. What's another question? Some of this have been answered by others, and I appreciate that. Okay. Yeah, and I guess in just summary, because I think most of my things have been addressed. I believe that the H zoning designation should have to go before the Planning Commission as a matter of process. I know we can finagle the legal language of our ordinance and say, well, the ordinance went before them at some point in the past, even though now we have something that's specific to zoning, and it has not been reviewed by the Planning Commission, and I have a lot of angst with that. And based on that, I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make a motion to defer defer 10-1078 to the August 16th zoning meeting. And specific to that deferral, I would like for the version of the ordinance which is the removing any reference. Oh, excuse me. No, we'll do it this way. Removing the version of the document that I'd like to go back before the Planning Commission is the one that is recommended by the Historic Preservation Committee, and includes the historic zoning designation. I would like that to go before the Planning Commission, and recommendations to come back before this body so that we can ensure that the proper process has been followed with regard to consideration of that particular new zoning designation. That is my motion.
May I ask a question of the motion?
I think we need to probably have a second.
Okay, I'll second the motion.
Okay. Is
My-
there any council discussion?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just a question. In the motion to defer, would they also be able to consider the other things, including other input from the HPC? I just wouldn't want to preclude them from having healthy dialogue with the HPC members about these various items.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that motion is not intended to
No.
preclude them from having those discussions. And I would support a motion to defer until August 16th with the presumption that they would meet, they would have the HPC, and they would resolve this contributory versus non-contributory, define the undue hardship, because I even heard our staff have a different perspective, because Lynn, in all due respect, you referenced the hardship referring to design, and yet Ken just pointed out that it refers to any hardship, and that's troubling. So again, I know we all care about historic preservation. We do want to get this done, but it seems that between the various entities, there's been a number of things at least mentioned that need to be clarified.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Okay.
It's my understanding that when this H zoning classification is done, it will go before the Planning Commission, correct? And they will have input into what goes into it at that time.
Yes, ma'am.
If I may clarify, though, that I think the distinction, and I understand that as well, Karen, and I appreciate you pointing that out. My understanding, though, is that if we were to approve this ordinance tonight with that included, even though it would go to them, it is already presupposing the existence of that zoning designation. And I think therein lies part of the challenge in what we've heard from citizens and from these folks, is that, yeah, they might be able to define it later, but the very existence of that inclusion here, when they've not been party to that discussion, is what is a divergence from what our process has been historically. And to Lynn's point about CPAC, and to your point, you stated well into the record, that CPAC is charged with land use and with zoning. And so it would be appropriate for that committee to be contemplating possible zoning districts, and they're not yet approving ordinances. I think that's the distinction here, is that this is an ordinance that would define that there, or would contemplate that there would indeed be that zoning designation. It's not, it might be, it's that it would be, and then the definition would follow. But for those reasons, I would support a deferral for no more than 60 days.
Bill, you got anything?
Say contemplation or not, I think, my opinion is this is what we've been working for almost 3 years, is to create an historic designation. Sure, it's contemplated. I think it's been contemplated for 3 years. I think to Karen's point here, the fact that this ordinance will go in front of the Planning Commission for the final approval, I think it's justification at this point to go ahead and do it. I think let's continue with that process.
Go ahead. Are you finished, Bill?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, the more people we get involved in this process, the more options we're going to have, the more decisions we're going to have to make, the more times we're going to have to defer this. I'm with Councilmember Lusk. I think that we put a lot of effort into this, and I don't see anything that is bad enough, doesn't cover what needs to be covered in terms of the language of the ordinance. And I think we just need to go back to this idea that we gave the Historic Preservation Committee a task. They've done the task. They're wanting to get some decision on that task, and we owe them a decision. And if we want to change it up after we decide, then great. Either as an ordinance or as an ordinance that wasn't passed, then reboot and start from a different document or with a different group of people. I just doesn't make any sense for me, from my point of view, to defer this. But we can vote on that.
Alan?
Somebody called the question.
You go ahead. We've gone down the thing. We'll go down one more time, and then I think it's
I
time to
just have a
vote.
question because one thing I have not heard answered. I've heard, Ms. Tolley say that she would have done it differently. I heard the question asked of Ms. Tolley, is there any other jurisdiction that she's aware of, either in the state of Georgia or outside the state of Georgia, that has an H zoning designation? And her answer, although you don't know all of the million jurisdictions in the country, but her answer was no, she's not aware of one, especially in the state of Georgia. One thing I have not heard from either the committee, the planning commission, the staff, or anyone on this council is why that approach is the way to go when that doesn't even exist anywhere. Why is this zoning designation necessary, needed, and the way to go in Milton when that example is not used anywhere else that we can possibly think of? I'm having a hard time approving something that has not been reviewed by the Planning Commission, that there's not an example of it anywhere that we can say that is the way to go.
I can try to answer some of that just real quick.
I haven't had my chance, and I think.
Okay.
It's all about you, isn't it?
It is. Tonight it is. I think I almost broke it. I've already stated that I'm not really in favor of deferring this. We've got a motion and a second, and I'd like to vote on that motion and see what it takes us. We have a motion that was made by Councilmember Tartt and seconded by Councilperson Zonner Bailey that was to take back, and I'm not going to be able to state it verbatim, but the as recommended by Historic Preservation Commission draft that we've received this evening. Committee, yes, thank you, Historic Preservation Committee. Take it back to the Planning Commission and let them review it and come back the 16th of August 2010. Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay.
Mayor Pro Tem, I'd like to make
Sorry, I shouldn't say Bert.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem, I was going to ask to make a motion.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask to make a motion. I started making a motion,
but I had actually called for the attention of Mayor.
I will have to say that Councilperson Zonner Bailey did ask my attention, so.
I think as a matter of order. I would put forward an alternative motion tonight, and I would put forward a motion to approve, make sure that I've got my correct documents in place since we have so many of them. Okay, first of all, I want to make sure I'm referencing tonight's proper agenda, since we have a bunch of those as well. Here's where your blue one. Make sure I've got the correct one. Okay, first I would like to put forward a motion to approve RZ 09-04, approval of an ordinance to create an Article 18 of the City of Milton zoning ordinance to establish a historic zoning commission in the City of Milton to provide for designation of historic properties, to provide for issuance of certificates of appropriateness, to provide for an appeals procedure, to repeal conflicting ordinances, and for other purposes. I would ask that we would modify the draft that's been before us, and that specifically I would ask that as a matter of this motion, that we remove reference to the historic zoning designation, and that also on page 14, that we modify the reference to undue hardship and specifically verify that undue hardship not be of any provision, but it specifically reference under undue.
You using this one? Or?
Well, in that case, it's both the same. But let's make sure it's the same page, Bill. On page 14 on both. So in this case, on page 14, that instead of referencing that there would be undue hardship that would allow the HPC the opportunity to have any provisions modified, that instead we would clarify that any of those would be specifically as it relates to design, and that any reference within that paragraph, and I would ask that this motion have our attorney and our staff modify it, but that effectively from the fourth sentence where it begins with shall and ends after purpose of the ordinance, that be modified so it's not to assume that commission has the authority to make any and all provisions, but that we clarify that it's design specific, as I think was the intent, but it's not as reflected here. And Lynn, if you would, just as a function of this motion, could you refer to me again on the waiver? I think that was the same section, correct, on undue hardship, about them being able to waiver, that would cover that item?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In terms of contributory versus non-contributory, can you again point me to that specific section? Again, because we've got so many documents, I'll make sure I'm referencing the correct documents.
And I'm going to have to find it, so if you'll just give me a moment.
Councilmember Zonabella, to the extent you're talking about the non-contributory having to go to the DRB, that's in section 5A and on the bottom of page 11.
Page 11.
Thank you, Ken.
And again, it clarifies that they just have to go back to the DRB. So I'm fine with that as long as that's the reference. It's not assuming that they have to make a decision, that they have to go back for review purposes. So my motion is to approve
Good.
the.
I wanted to hear you restate that.
I'm suggesting an approval of this item, simply removing reference to the zoning, to the historic zoning designation, and modifying on page 14 the undue hardship, and rather than reference any and all provisions of the ordinance, that it would only allow for a potential modification of a design standard specifically if undue hardship were proven, but that it be specific to that, as opposed to what it says currently, which is any and all provisions of the ordinance.
Second motion.
Okay, we have a motion that was made by Councilperson Zonner Bailey to approve RZ 0904 with some changes are they captured? The changes that she made?
I get it.
Okay.
And trying to make sure that I realize that there's a lot of different
And
versions.
Councilmember Zonabella, just for, I think this is implicit in your motion, every reference with respect to the historic zoning would need to be then pulled out.
That's correct, for consistency.
And it was seconded by Councilmember Tart. Not hearing any discussion. All those in favor of this motion, please vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay. Mayor Pro Tem, may I make a motion now?
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to make a motion that we approve RZ09, approval of an ordinance to create Article 18 of the City of Milton zoning ordinance to establish a historic preservation commission in the City of Milton, to provide for designation of historic properties, to provide for issuance of certificates of appropriateness, to provide for an appeals procedure, and to repeal conflicting ordinances and for other purposes. Based on the recommended by the Historic Preservation Commission, I would like to make one change to, on the bottom of page 13, section 5G, undue hardship. I would like it to state that the commission in passing upon application shall have the power to recommend to the city council to modify, to vary or modify strict provisions. And then also on the next part of the thing where it says the city council has the actual ultimate authority. So I really believe that if we're making changes, approving variances for historic structures, that the city council needs to have the ultimate yes or no based on a recommendation by the Historic Preservation Commission. But other than that, I'd like it to go based on the ordinance that was presented by the Historic Preservation Commission.
Second motion.
All right, we now have a motion made by Councilperson Thurman and seconded by Councilperson Lusk to approve RZ 0904, an ordinance to create Article 18 of the City of Milton zoning ordinance to establish a Historic Preservation Commission in the City of Milton, to provide for designation of historic properties, to provide for issuance of certificates of appropriateness, to provide for an appeals procedure, and to repeal conflicting ordinances and for other purposes, with a couple of changes that were hopefully captured on Section 5G to give the City Council the ultimate say-so in varying from the ordinance. That hits that right?
Got it.
All right. Hearing any discussion? All those in favor?
Sorry,
No.
Mayor.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My vote will reflect my concern with the zoning designation specifically. Just for the record, I continue to support historic preservation, but am concerned about the commingling of these two.
Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 4 to 2. And I think I think we all appreciate, and we all are concerned with historic preservation in the city. I don't think that was ever in question. And we appreciate the hard work on our committees putting this ordinance together. Moving on to unfinished business, will the clerk sound the item?
Approval of an ordinance to amend Chapter 20, Environment, Article 6, Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control of the City of Milton Code of Ordinances. This is agenda item number 10, 1139. Previously discussed, April 19th work session. First presentation, May 17th council meeting. Public hearing was held on June 7th. Lynn Tolley.
As you all may remember, this is a requirement from the state DNR to, again, model their model ordinance, but they require that so that we maintain our issuing authority. So this is a little bit less restrictive regarding that. But the proposal herein does include all the changes from the state's recommended model ordinance and does comply with it. We have sent our copy to the state for verification. We haven't heard any comments which are negative or that have asked us to make any additional changes. Are there any questions?
Anybody have any questions up here?
No, sir.
Right.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes,
Jimmy's
sir, Mr.
here
Murphy.
if y'all really want to ask something.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, where's the supporters for the soil?
Right there. Yep. We just wanted to keep Jimmy here, for no reason. All right, Mr. Lusk, did you have something?
I do, sir.
Okay.
And I'd like to make a motion to approve an ordinance to amend Chapter 20, Environment, Article 6, Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control, the City of Milton Code of Ordinances, agenda item number 10-1139.
I'll second the motion.
All right. We have a motion presented by Councilperson Lusk and seconded by Councilperson Zonner Bailey to approve an ordinance to amend Chapter 20, Environment, Article 6, Soil Erosion and Sedimentation Control of the City of Milton, Georgia Code of Ordinances. Hearing no discussion, all those in favor, please vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It passes unanimously.
Jimmy, thank you. It is important stuff, and we do pay attention to it. It's just that you're doing a great job, so thanks.
And we appreciate you staying here. There are currently no items under new business, so moving on to mayor and council reports. It says, do I want to make a report on anything? I actually do. I was, I guess, fortunate or unfortunate enough to happen upon one of the fires we had last week out of Tullamore, and it was certainly a blaze, and I think the chief was up there. We stayed pretty well back, but I just want to commend y'all. I know that y'all had a busy night last Tuesday night, and thank the city of Alpharetta and for their support and help, and wish a speedy recovery to the injured Alpharetta firefighter.
He's recovered.
Cool. That's all I had.
Yeah, thank you for protecting our homes and lives.
Does anyone else on the council have a report?
The only thing I was going to say is I did contact Chris and Lynn earlier today. I believe a lot of us may have gotten a phone call from the headmaster at the Chandler School.
I think y'all did.
Yes, we all did. They are looking into that. It looks like there was just a problem with the address itself. His property, there's not being a barn being built in the front of his property, which is what he was afraid of. So the Fulton County tax records for that piece of property show 0 address. So the address that was used was the next door neighbor's address, and that's where the confusion lies. But I think he has been calmed down. So,
and I appreciate you bringing that up. I do have a question, and obviously we all have been contacted by Mr. Hudson. In terms of the process, because an item did go to the BZA, and I don't know if you can speak to it just hypothetically at this point, but typically if something goes to the BZA with an incorrect address, does it effectively mean that that decision is stayed and it just has to go back through the process? And it may be that you're not prepared yet to speak to it.
He's working on it. We haven't gotten a response.
Okay, yeah, Councilman Zonner Bailey, apparently my office is looking at it. It was brought to my attention, and I'm sure that we'll get your response back on it.
But I'm assuming that a process like that would be required. So if anybody's got a concern, it's not as though we're going to bypass it. If it was
That's
incorrect, we'll
probably
correct it.
so. You got to be careful about your legal ads at that point.
Right. Thank you.
Councilperson Lusk.
I don't want to open up a can of worms.
Well, let's don't then.
Come on now. I'd love to go fish tonight. But if that parcel there has 0 address on it, how does it appear on the tax record?
A 0 address.
Yes, sir. It's got a parcel number that's a unique identifier, however, the address number is not.
It was my understanding that basically that parcel effectively was kind of split up and that he acquired part of it and the remaining land is still in place.
Fulton County typically did not issue an address until you pulled the building permit, so it had no address. It shows a 0 Hopewell Road.
But taxes still being paid, I think.
Yeah.
We can make them 13525.5. Just kidding.
Okay.
Just kidding.
Have been any staff reports?
Now, the bulk of what we'll talk about tonight in executive session, reminder of GMA this Friday. You all have some checks in front of you, I think. Are they sitting up there?
They're in my packet.
Yes.
The purpose of those, as you just want to follow up, purpose of those is to try to make the accounting for this particular conference easy when you return. We can, based on our travel policy, we can disperse per diem and mileage in one of 2 different ways. One is based on actual receipts, and the second is to go to the GSA website and find out what the approved meal and incidental rate is for the specific city that we're traveling to. We've elected to do that this year, and just in an effort to try to make it easier. It always seems as though somebody washes a pair of pants that has a receipt in it or something, and we get back and we're all over the place trying to get receipts for what we use. So hopefully that'll make it easier. Some of you in the past have not wanted mileage reimbursement for whatever reason. You're certainly entitled to it. If you choose not to accept it, you don't have to cash those checks. You can certainly return them to me, and we'll put them back into the city funds. But that kind of completes that circle. Yes, sir.
Real quick question. This comes out of a budget that's set up specifically for this conference, or does this come out of the budget where each council member has a certain amount that they can expense?
No, it does. It comes out of, we budget for professional development as well as travel.
Okay.
So this comes out of travel. The registration for the conference comes out of professional
All
development.
right, thank you.
What about when we go to GMA trainings? Because I was led to believe that GMA trainings come out of our per diem or whatever you want to call that stipend. Yeah.
I'll have to check with Stacy on that one, but I know we specifically budget a line item for travel for this particular conference.
Okay. Gotcha.
All right, is that all the staff reports?
It is. We'll do the rest. We'll
Okay.
talk the rest in executive session.
Well, added by motion and vote, we had a executive session to discuss potential litigation on land acquisition, I believe.
I'd like to make a motion that we adjourn to executive session to discuss property acquisition pending litigation.
I'll second the motion.
Had a motion by Councilperson Lusk and a second by Councilperson Tartt to adjourn to executive session to discuss property acquisition and potential litigation. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passed unanimously.